Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Executive Compensation Podcast. Today, I am super excited to have Annette Leckie here on the show from Meridian Compensation Partners, and we're going to be talking about, have you reviewed your clawback policy lately? And so, Annette, welcome to the show, and can you give everyone a quick introduction to who you are and what you do at Meridian?
Certainly. Thank you, Jake. I'm an executive compensation consultant. I work with boards and compensation committees in all things related to executive compensation and governance.
Perfect. Well, I'm excited to dive in here. And so to kick things off here, it seems like everything you hear about these days is all ESG. We've had a lot of these interviews around ESG. And so what else should directors be thinking about or focused on right now at the moment?
Yes, I agree. It seems like ESG is taking up all the airtime and print space in executive compensation these days. But there is actually one other topic that I think is important that directors focus on right now, and that is taking a fresh look at their clawback policy. There's been lots of things that have happened over the last few years, and several reasons that make now a good time to do that. One of the first reasons would be that the SEC has signaled that they will be taking up this topic and revisiting the Dodd-Frank rules that came out in 2010 that are still waiting to be finalized. So even though the Dodd-Frank rules are themselves fairly narrow in scope, it's a signal to the broader market is interested in this topic. So that's the first reason for taking a look now. The second reason is there are lots of shareholder proposals still coming out that are asking companies to take a look at and either adopt or expand their current clawback policies. And though they're not very many in number, they are getting lots of support. Usually shareholder proposals get barely single-digit support from investors, but these particular shareholder proposals are getting significant minority and sometimes majority support. Again, a strong signal that this is important to investors. The third reason is that a lot has happened and the overall governance environment has fundamentally shifted. Investors and the markets at large are expecting a lot more from companies and from their boards. And so this is a great time to take a fresh look at these policies and make sure that boards have all the tools they would need to execute a clawback if something in their company went sideways.
That is great and super, super helpful information. And one of the things that I want to dive a little bit, and I think you'll be getting into this, but I definitely want to understand also a little bit more about the Dodd-Frank Act for all of those listeners who may not be super familiar. So I know you earlier mentioned that the SEC may propose requirements for clawbacks in relation to this. And so what will those requirements look like? Certainly.
Let me give a little bit of history first for that background and give the context. Back in 2010, after the financial crisis, Congress passed what we call the Dodd-Frank Act. And one of the many, many provisions of that act is a requirement for companies to adopt a clawback policy. And that policy would require companies, in the event of a financial restatement, to claw back any excess compensation that was awarded to all executives, current or former executives. And so notice that it does say all executives, regardless of any kind of fault. Many clawback policies today are what we call a bare bones policy. And it would say if there is a misconduct and that led to a financial restatement, then executives would need to the companies would need to claw back from the executive that caused the misconduct that led to the restatement. Under the Dodd-Frank provision, there would be no fault. It would be if there is a restatement, executives got more than they should, they will be required to claw that money back. Now, the SEC is supposed to issue guidelines clarifying these policies and how companies would have to implement them. They did actually propose some rules back in 2015, but they were never finalized. So now we find that the SEC has put these rules again on their short-term agenda, but they've been on that agenda since 2019. The difference now is that we have a newly constituted SEC that is much more focused on executive compensation matters. So we may actually see action from the SEC. But keep in mind that this would be still a fairly narrow portion of what would be a broader clawback policy focused on restatements. And if they do repropose these rules, there would be a comment period and there would be some further deliberations before they're finalized. And what's interesting is back in 2010 and also after 2015, when they issued the proposed rules, many companies decided that they would just wait until the SEC finalized these rules before updating or finalizing their own policies. But what's happened is there's been a number of very high-profile controversies. Companies have gotten in trouble. And frankly, some boards have been caught flat-footed, and they haven't had a robust enough clawback policy to execute clawbacks when their investors, as well as the public at large, really thought they should have been able to do that. So that has been a lesson to other companies to not necessarily wait around for the SEC, but to take action now and to make sure their policies are robust enough to move forward.
That makes sense. It seems like a lot of people, I guess, are procrastinating, waiting for the regulation to come. But it sounds like what you're saying is that there's enough media attention around this and that it just needs to be kind of fixed regardless to get ahead of it, just for best practices and for the eventual SEC regulation as well.
Exactly.
Yeah. So what kinds of provisions have, leading best-in-class companies included in their clawback policies?
The first thing that I'd say companies need to look at, and what most companies that have focused on this have done, is to separate out this notion of misconduct leading to a restatement, the bare bones policy I described earlier. Both of those need to be separated and stand alone. Once the SEC finalizes rules, they will be focused on the restatement. But it's really the misconduct that gets most people upset when they find out about controversies, and that companies should focus on. So having misconduct as a standalone trigger is important. In fact, if you go back and look at all the big controversies and the headlines, and even in situations where companies have executed clawbacks, none of those involved a restatement. Restatements are very rare these days. So focusing on the misconduct end of that is important. So there's lots of potential definitions for misconduct. The first category I'd say are criminal activities, so fraud, embezzlement. Those are kind of no-brainers to include in a definition for misconduct for clawback. A next category might require a little bit more thought, but is equally important, and that would be a violation of a company policy. Now, a company policy could be a code of conduct, it could be an ethics policy, it could be a risk policy, or maybe even restrictive covenants, something like a non-compete or a non-solicitation. Now, you want to make sure that executives don't feel like they can be tripped up over some minor violation, like a missed training session or something like that. So usually these kinds of violations are qualified by saying it's something that led to or could have led to material harm to the company, whether that be financial harm, reputational harm, or competitive harm. But these are the kinds of triggers, violations of policies, that most companies would use in the event of a sexual harassment case or a Me Too type of incident. So they're an important consideration to include in these policies. You might also see triggers such as a failure to act, like a failure to supervise. So all of these triggers that I've just described are meant to punish and hopefully deter bad behavior. But there's a whole separate category of triggers that companies should think about, and that is the fairness issue around receiving compensation that wasn't really earned. So the Dodd-Frank provisions would fall into that category because they are a result of a restatement and excess compensation. But companies have taken that same fairness issue a step further and said, what if there's simply a miscalculation? There's no misconduct, it doesn't lead to a restatement, but clearly executives got more than they should have. And so companies include that, a miscalculation, as a potential trigger. Or even including a trigger that would say, if we have a material reduction in company performance or business unit performance, that should trigger a review to see if a clawback is needed, with the thinking that if something happened that was that drastic, that means executives may not have been properly evaluating risks. And so let's take a look at that and see if it would be warrant further action.
That makes sense. And you provide so many examples to think through all of the various ways or things that could trigger these. And you can see just how many things of that could lead to this. And especially even in today's like political climate, where someone could say something that leads to damage to the company. There's so many of these cases, things like that coming out, where I think these all could definitely kind of trigger something like this. And so you've talked about things that, might trigger a clawback. What are other things that directors should consider as part of their policy?
So the first thing is to decide, once one of these triggers has happened, should that result in an actual clawback, which means you take money back from an executive who has already received that payment, or should it result in a forfeiture? And that is simply canceling outstanding or unvested awards the executives have received, but they haven't actually gotten the payment yet. Obviously, a forfeiture is a lot easier to execute. And so what some companies have done is basically create two tiers of triggers and saving the more egregious triggers to result in clawbacks and the rest to result in just simply forfeitures. But what a number of companies have done is, just for simplicity, is say any of these triggers may result in either a clawback or a forfeiture, and leave that to the discretion of the board or the compensation committee. And that leads to the next big consideration, is how much discretion to allow within this policy. Right now, under the Dodd-Frank rules that the SEC is reviewing, there would be no discretion allowed with respect to a restatement. And a restatement, it would be required to claw back any excess compensation. But what most companies have done today, and most clawback policies out there, do allow significant discretion for the board or the compensation committee to take into account what the situation was, what are the facts and circumstances, what is the materiality of the clawback, and to exercise that discretion in making a final determination. Other things to think about: who is covered? Is this just for executives? Is this for all incentive participants? Does it cover former participants, former executives? What pay is covered? Obviously, your annual bonus is included. Often incentive equity is included, performance equity. But what about time-based equity? Options, restricted shares that are time-based, are they covered? What about severance? You might have paid severance before certain facts and circumstances came to light. Should that be eligible for clawback as well? How far back do you look? Is it pay the executive received last year, 2 years ago, 3 years ago? And for forfeitures, how far forward do you look? Is it pay the executive would have received next year, the year after, or all outstanding awards that they've received? Should an executive be required to be terminated in order to execute a clawback? Or are there situations where an executive may remain employed with the company, but a clawback is still appropriate? So all of these things need to be part of a documented clawback policy.
All right. So there's a lot going into that, and a lot to consider. And so, if a board member wants to start the discussion around this, what is the first step?
So the first thing is to understand what you have in place today. And it may not all be a documented part of your clawback policy. So take an inventory. Start with the formal clawback policy and look at the provisions. But then also take a look at incentive plan documents, your bonus plan, your equity plan. There may be provisions included in those documents that should be added to the inventory. Look at equity award agreements. Oftentimes there are forfeiture provisions included in those that should be documented and included in the inventory. Look at individual contracts, employment agreements, even offer letters, just to see if there's any individual circumstances out there that need to be documented. Change of control plans sometimes also include provisions. So once you have this full inventory of all the provisions that you have in place, first thing to do is to make sure that none of these provisions conflict with each other. The second, and most important, is to then take a step back and think through some of the headlines where companies have gotten themselves into trouble lately, and ask yourself whether you and your board would have been able to take action if something like that had happened at your company. And if the answer is no, based on your current provisions, think about whether expanding your current policy is something that you should be looking at. Most companies that develop these policies, they want to develop a good policy, put it on the shelf, forget about it, and hopefully never have to use it. But the best time to think about changing the policy is before you ever have to need it.
That is phenomenal advice. And so, as we kind of wrap up here, one kind of just summarizing kind of piece here, if you had to, if you were talking to a company, committee or board that was in those shoes of procrastinating and putting this off and not looking at it, what would be the final words that you would say to someone in that seat?
I'd say take a look at what you have and make sure you would have been able to take action, because I think a lot of these companies that were caught flat-footed regret not taking a closer look at this sooner. So pay attention to the headlines and make sure that it would never be you in those headlines.
Awesome. That's phenomenal advice. Well, thank you for taking the time to come on here, Annette.
Thank you, Jake.